Advancements in DNA testing solved this case out of Southfield, bringing a family some peace after almost 3 decades.
It was a credit card and fingernail clippings from the murder scene led Southfield police to their suspect. After 29 years, he was arrested for the murder of a Southfield woman this month in Illinois.
You got a warrant.
For what?
Out of traffic warrant?
A traffic warrant?
I don't know. Out of St. Clair?
I ain't been to St. Clair.
Put you up here.
You are standing in a hallway in Southfield, Michigan, and the man across from you has stopped being your neighbor. He is a fist closing around a knife handle, and you are reaching for anything within reach: a door frame, a chair, the air itself, anything that buys you one more second. Deborah Kennedy bought herself several. She used them to drag her fingernails across her attacker's skin, hard enough to take a piece of him with her. She did not know that the piece of skin caught under her nails, smaller than a grain of rice, was the only honest witness left in that house, and that it would take 29 years for anyone to ask it the right question. The struggle carried her from one room into another on the night of February 19, 1997. It left blood on the walls of a single-story home on Lee Baker Drive. Nobody broke a window to get inside that house. Nobody forced a lock. Deborah opened her own door for the man who killed her, and somewhere in the chaos that followed, one of her credit cards slid out of a pocket or a purse and landed face up on the bedroom floor. It carried a fingerprint that did not belong to her. In 1997, that print was too faint for any machine in Michigan to read. The DNA beneath her nails was too small a sample for the technology of that decade to use. Both pieces of evidence went into a sealed container exactly as they were found, logged and shelved. The man who left them behind pulled the front door shut behind him on his way out, so it would lock on its own. He would not be seen in Michigan again for 29 years. Welcome back to True Crime Files documentary. This is a case where the killer never had to drive anywhere to watch the investigation into his own crime. He could see it from across his own street. It would take 29 years, 2 federal databases, and one detective willing to pull a single folder out of a drawer holding thousands of others, before anyone understood that. If you're new to this channel, this is what we do. Cold cases where the evidence finally catches up to the truth. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. We read every one of them. And if you want to be here the next time a file like this gets pulled back out of storage, hit subscribe. Now, let's go back to that house on Lee Baker Drive. Deborah Renee Kennedy was 40 years old, and she had built a life that depended on no one. She lived by herself in a brick ranch house on Lee Baker Drive. In a Southfield neighborhood, where the driveways sat close enough together that neighbors knew which cars belonged on the block and which ones didn't. She worked in engineering at the GM Technical Center in Warren, inside the research and design operation that kept the country's largest automaker running. And she had been there long enough that her schedule had become a kind of fixture. Her coworkers didn't need to check a calendar to know when she'd walk in. They simply expected her. That dependability is, in its own quiet way, the only kind of biography some people leave behind, and it is not a small one. It means somebody noticed within hours, not days, that something was wrong. On the morning of February 20th, when Deborah did not arrive at the tech center and did not answer her phone, a coworker did not wait around to see if she'd turn up. She called the Southfield Police Department directly and asked them to go to the house on Lee Baker Drive and check on her. In 1997, the engineering floors at a place like the GM Technical Center were not exactly crowded with women her age doing her kind of work. And the people who sat near her would later describe someone who simply did the job day after day, without making it a topic of conversation. She wasn't building toward one dramatic milestone. She was building the kind of life that takes longer to describe than a headline allows, a career, a house that belonged only to her. A string of unremarkable Tuesdays and Wednesdays that were supposed to keep adding up. She drove the same roads to Warren every morning that thousands of other GM employees drove, merging into the kind of traffic that turns a commute into background noise rather than an event. Her house on Lee Baker Drive was modest by design rather than necessity, a single woman's choice to live within her means rather than to prove anything to anyone. Neighbors who passed her in a driveway or at a mailbox would later struggle to produce a single dramatic anecdote, and that, too, is its own kind of testimony. Some lives get described in stories. Hers gets described in routine, in the version of a person who is reliable enough that her absence, and not her presence, is what finally gets noticed. There is no record of what that last ordinary morning looked like in detail. What she ate, what she wore onto the GM campus, what she said to whoever she passed in the hallway on her way out. What the record does show is that February 19, 1997, was a Wednesday like all the ones that had come before it. She went to work. She came home. By every account her family has given since, she was a woman people were drawn to rather than simply tolerant of. She came home that evening to a quiet street, the kind where a stranger's car gets noticed. Somewhere after that, someone she did not consider a stranger knocked on her door, and she opened it. On the evening of February 19th, that string of ordinary days ran out. The house on Lee Baker Drive sits quiet at the end of the day, lights coming on in the front windows the way they do up and down the block. A man crosses the street. He has crossed it before. He lives close enough that the walk barely qualifies as one, and he climbs the front steps and knocks. It is February in southeastern Michigan, the kind of evening that turns dark before 6 o'clock and leaves a skin of old snow pushed up against the curbs. The porch light over Deborah's door throws a small circle of yellow onto the steps. Inside that circle, for a few seconds, two neighbors stand facing each other the way they always have. Deborah opens the door. What happens next does not happen quickly. The fight moves from the front of the house toward the back, knocking furniture out of place as it goes. Blood marks the walls along the path the struggle takes. Deborah does not go down easily, and she does not go down quietly. She gets her hands on him, not just to push him away, but to hold on, to dig in, to leave something of him behind on her own skin before this is over. Beneath her fingernails, in the seconds that matter most, she collects a sample of her killer's skin cells. Packed into the soft tissue, without either of them fully understanding what she has just done. A lamp goes over. A chair is shoved hard enough to leave a mark on the wall behind it. None of it slows him down enough to change what happens, but all of it will still be there the next morning. Photographed and measured and logged, a map of exactly how hard she fought before she stopped being able to. He stabs her multiple times. It is the wound pattern more than anything else that will tell the medical examiner what kind of violence happened inside this house, close, personal, and prolonged enough to prove a real struggle rather than a single decisive blow. When it is over, he does not run. He moves through the house with enough composure to wipe down the surfaces he remembers touching. He picks up the knife. He does not look for anything to take. Nothing will ever turn up missing from that house, because taking something was never the point. He pulls the front door shut behind him on his way out, hard enough that the latch catches and the lock sets on its own, the same as it would on any other ordinary night on Lee Baker Drive. Somewhere in the disorder behind him, on the bedroom floor, a credit card lies face up where it landed during the fight. It carries a single, faint print, a partial, smudged from one contact but present. The next morning, Deborah does not arrive at the GM Technical Center. Her absence registers almost immediately because her presence had never been a question mark before. A coworker tries her phone. Nothing. The coworker calls the Southfield Police Department and asks them to send someone to the house on Lee Baker Drive, just to check. Officers arrive and find the front door undamaged, no pried frame, no broken glass, no sign that anyone forced their way inside. They go in anyway, because a welfare check doesn't wait for permission once the silence on the other end of a phone line starts to feel wrong. They find Deborah inside, dead, in a home that had not been broken into by anyone. Southfield detectives process the scene that day. They photograph every room, catalog the contents, and document the blood spatter and the displaced furniture along the path the struggle had taken. 2 pieces of what they collect will matter more than everything else combined: the partial print on the credit card and the material recovered from beneath Deborah's fingernails. Both go into sealed evidence containers and into storage, intact, waiting for a kind of science that does not exist yet. Southfield in the 1990s was a middle-class suburb built out of farmland in the decades after the Second World War. Filling in with office parks and quiet residential streets lined with brick ranches and split levels. Lee Baker Drive was one of those streets, houses close enough together that a stranger's car got noticed within a day, where people recognized which vehicles belonged on the block before they ever bothered to recognize the people driving them. It was the kind of place where a homicide committed by a stranger should have produced at least one early lead. This one didn't, because nothing about the violence inside that house matched the pattern the neighborhood was built to flag. Detectives canvass Lee Baker Drive and the surrounding streets, asking the obvious first questions. Any unfamiliar cars on the block? Any strangers seen walking through? Anything out of place in the hours before Deborah was found? The neighborhood gives them nothing usable. Every car anyone mentions belongs to somebody who already lives there. They build a list: coworkers from the tech center, friends, family, anyone with a plausible reason to have been inside that house or in front of it, and they work through it name by name. Delivery people, service workers, distant relatives. One after another, people are interviewed, accounted for, and cleared. Nobody on that list explains the print on the credit card. Nobody on that list explains what's under Deborah's fingernails. Each interview follows the same shape. A name comes in. A detective sits down with that person, asks where they were, asks what they know, asks whether they ever had reason to be inside that house. Most of the answers check out within a day. A few take longer, run down through alibis and phone records and second-hand accounts, before they check out too. By summer, the list that once held dozens of names has been worked down to nothing usable. And the investigation is left holding exactly what it started with: a print nobody can read and a sample nobody can use. Officers run the latent print through Michigan's automated fingerprint identification system. Nothing comes back. They send the nail scrapings to the lab for the limited genetic testing available in 1997, and the sample is too small, too degraded, for the methods of that era to produce a usable profile. The 2 strongest pieces of physical evidence from the entire scene point at the exact same person, and neither one of them can say his name. There is no broken lock to explain, no missing weapon to recover, no forced point of entry anywhere in the house. Everything about the scene tells detectives the same thing. This was not a stranger who wandered in off the street. This was somebody Deborah let inside. The investigation chases that theory through the spring of 1997 and into the summer, and it does not find its man. The case stays open. Tips come in over the following months and lead nowhere. Detectives rotate onto newer cases and return to the Kennedy file whenever something new surfaces, and for a long time, nothing does. The credit card and the nail scrapings stay exactly where they were placed in 1997, intact, sealed, and unmatched to anyone. Forensic science did not stand still while the file sat in storage. Through the late 1990s and into the next 2 decades, DNA testing grew sensitive enough to work from samples a fraction of the size 1997 had needed. And fingerprint software learned to enhance partial latents that older systems had simply rejected as unreadable. National fingerprint and DNA databases grew with every new arrest booked anywhere in the country. Each of those advances happened without anyone touching the Kennedy file, because nobody yet had a reason to spend the money or the lab time on a resubmission that, as far as anyone in 1997 knew, would only come back the same way it had the first time. Reggie Daniel was Deborah's first cousin, and he is the reason this file never fully disappeared into a box nobody opened again. He never stopped believing the file held an answer, even during the years when nobody at the department could tell him anything beyond the fact that it remained open. He called the Southfield Police Department. Then he called again. Year after year, he asked the same 2 questions. Had anything changed, and was anybody still looking? The answer for most of 3 decades was the same answer every time: nothing yet. Deborah didn't deserve what happened to her, he would say later, describing those years and decades without anyone held accountable left a wound that simply never closed. It just kept nagging me, he said. Nobody apprehended, no name, no resolution. Just the file, the wait, and Reggie picking up the phone again every so often to make sure the case was still a case, and not a memory the department had quietly let go of. While Reggie called, the man who had killed his cousin was building an ordinary life several states away. He left Michigan within 2 months of the murder, first for Arizona, more than 1,000 miles from Oakland County. He drifted back through Michigan for a stretch, Oak Park, then Highland Park, before finally settling in Royal Lake, Illinois, a community of roughly 300 people. Nobody in Royal Lake had any reason to ask him about a house on Lee Baker Drive. He drove. He worked. He ran errands like everybody else in a town that size. And along the way, he picked up other arrests. Police would later describe him as no stranger to break-ins or to assaultive crime. Each of those arrests put his fingerprints back into a national identification system. At some point, his DNA went into one too. None of those bookings connected him back to Michigan in the eyes of the officers who processed him. He was, to every department that handled him in those years, simply a name, a charge, and a fingerprint card, one more file moving through a system built to hold that volume of information without ever cross-referencing all of it automatically. He paid a mortgage. He waved at neighbors over a fence. By every appearance available to the people around him in Royal Lake, he was exactly who he said he was. The system worked precisely as designed. It had simply never been asked the one question that mattered. This is the part of the case that is hardest to sit with, because it is not a story about a clue nobody could find. It is a story about an answer that already existed, sitting inside a federal database for years, waiting for somebody to ask it a single question it was already capable of answering. His DNA profile and the genetic material scraped from beneath Deborah's fingernails occupied the same national system for years without ever being compared to each other. The connection was not theoretical or fragile. It was complete, sitting there the moment his profile was uploaded. Nobody had flagged the Kennedy samples for a fresh comparison. Resubmitting old evidence isn't automatic. A detective has to choose the file. A chief has to approve the lab time. A forensic team has to actually do the work. None of that had happened yet, so the match simply waited, filed under a case number nobody was actively running, inside a system that had already done its part. By 2023, Reggie had stopped relying on phone calls. He drove to the Southfield Police Department and asked, in person, for somebody to look at his cousin's case one more time. Chief Elvin Barron would later say that conversation mattered, that a person standing in a lobby asking the question carries a different weight than a voice on a phone line that's easy enough to put down. The file came back out of the drawer the following June. In June of 2024, a Southfield detective named Brian Weeks walked into the police administration building with a request that had nothing to do with any one case yet. He wanted permission to go back through the cold case archive and find files where modern forensic science had a realistic shot at producing something the original investigators couldn't. He brought the idea to Chief Elvin Barron, who told him to start with cases involving DNA. Those, the chief said, carried the highest odds of a workable result. Weeks chose his own cases. He pulled dozens of folders out of storage over the following weeks, working back through a shelf of files that had outlived 2 police chiefs and most of the careers that opened them. The Kennedy file was one of them. Weeks was not new to homicide work, but a cold case carries a different weight than an active one. There's no fresh scene to walk, no witness whose memory is still sharp enough to trust completely. There's only paper, photographs taken on film instead of a phone, and the judgment calls of detectives who made their decisions with the tools they had in 1997, not the tools that exist now. Weeks's job wasn't to second-guess any of those calls. It was to ask whether anything in that paper trail might behave differently if it were run through the technology of 2024 instead. He read through everything the 1997 detectives had left behind. The original reports, the crime scene photographs, the canvas notes, the witness list, the lab results that had come back empty. He went through the evidence log line by line and found the 2 items nobody had ever matched to anyone, the partial print on the credit card and the genetic material recovered from beneath Deborah's nails. What struck him wasn't anything the 1997 investigators had missed. It was how much they had gotten right. They had collected the right material. They had run it through every test available to them at the time. They had built a clean, careful case file around evidence that, in their era, simply could not speak yet. 27 years had passed since anyone in a lab had touched those 2 items, and in that time the instruments had changed. The databases had grown by tens of millions of entries. And the man who left that print and that DNA behind might easily have been arrested for something else in the years since, booked under his real name, fingerprinted, swabbed, and folded into systems that hadn't existed in 1997. Weeks didn't work the file alone. Some of the original 1997 detectives, retired for years by then, came back in to consult. They had built this case when they were younger, working with tools that ran out before the truth did, and they wanted to see what the file could do now, in someone else's hands. He resubmitted the print first. Modern enhancement software cleaned up the image lifted off that credit card decades earlier, sharpened the ridge detail that 1997's machines had no way to read, and ran the result against the National Fingerprint Database. In January of 2025, it returned a name, a man who had been arrested multiple times both before and after 1997, each booking adding his prints to the federal system a little more permanently. For 28 years, his fingerprints and the partial from Deborah's credit card had occupied the same national database without anyone running the comparison. Once Weeks finally did, the system gave him an answer in minutes. He didn't move on a fingerprint alone. He sent the fingernail scrapings out for genetic testing, using methods built to work with samples far smaller and more degraded than anything 1997's labs could process. The results took 8 months. In September of 2025, the profile extracted from beneath Deborah's nails matched a sample already sitting in the National DNA Database. the same man the fingerprint had already pointed to. Weeks had his second confirmation on the same suspect, from two different pieces of evidence, 28 years apart. He brought both results to Chief Barron. Barron reviewed the findings and signed off, and for the first time since February of 1997, the Southfield Police Department had a name to build a warrant around. The name on the warrant was Robert Joseph Covington. For nearly 2 years, the file had been a stack of decades-old paper. For the length of one afternoon in January, it became a name on a screen, Robert Joseph Covington, attached to an address 3 states away, and to a string of arrests that had nothing to do with Deborah Kennedy, and everything to do with the kind of man he had been the entire time nobody had bothered to look. Robert Joseph Covington had been 29 years old in February of 1997. He had lived with his wife and his mother-in-law in a house directly across the street from Deborah Kennedy on Lee Baker Drive. Both of those women have since died. For however long Covington had lived on that block before February of 1997, he had been exactly the kind of presence a quiet street absorbs without remark. A young husband, a young son-in-law, a car in a driveway across from Deborah's own. Nothing about that presence had ever needed an explanation before. In 1997, detectives went door to door on that street asking the only question they had to work with. Did anyone see a car that didn't belong on the block? Nobody had. Every car parked on Lee Baker Drive that February belonged to somebody who lived there, and that was the problem. Covington's car belonged there too. It had always belonged there. From his own driveway on an ordinary evening, he could see her front door. He was never on the original suspect list. There was no reason to put him there. He wasn't a stranger walking through an unfamiliar neighborhood. He was the view out his own living room window. Police have offered 2 working theories of how that February evening actually unfolded, and neither one requires him to have broken anything to get inside. In the first, Covington knew Deborah's schedule well enough to let himself into the house while she was out, then waited for her to come home. In the second, Deborah was on friendly enough terms with Covington's mother-in-law that she opened the door for her neighbor without hesitation, only for him to force his way past her once she had. Investigators say they don't know which version is closer to the truth, and they may never know for certain. What they do know is that the door was never broken because it never had to be. There is a particular kind of failure in this case that has nothing to do with the science of 1997 and everything to do with proximity. Detectives did the work the textbook called for. They walked the block, they asked about strangers, they asked about cars. They got truthful answers from every neighbor they spoke to, and every one of those truthful answers pointed away from the man who had actually done it. Because he wasn't strange to that street at all. He belonged there in every way. The canvas was built to measure. The only thing that could ever expose him was something a canvas could never see: a fragment of skin under 4 fingernails, and a single fingerprint pressed into plastic during a struggle he thought he'd cleaned up behind him. He had been close enough the entire time to watch the police tape go up from his own front window. Nobody on Lee Baker Drive ever thought to look that close. According to Chief Barron, the actual motive may never be known at all. 29 years is long enough for a question like that to outlive any honest answer. What forensic science could finally settle wasn't why, it was who, and the answer to who had been visible from a window the entire time. A closed case doesn't undo 29 years of not knowing. It doesn't give anyone back the version of those decades they would have lived if the answer had come sooner. What it does is smaller and, in its own way, just as necessary. It lets a family stop carrying a question alongside the grief and start carrying the grief alone. By March of 2026, Covington was 58 years old and had spent years living quietly in Royal Lake, Illinois. Southfield detectives had what they needed for a warrant out of Oakland County, but finding him and taking him into custody safely required coordination across state lines. Over several weeks, Southfield investigators worked with the Macoupin County Sheriff's Office and the Illinois State Police to locate him and plan an arrest that wouldn't put anyone at risk. A man who has spent 29 years believing himself forgotten doesn't always behave predictably the moment that assumption breaks. And investigators built their plan around that uncertainty, rather than around any expectation of how he might react. They picked the time, the road, and the method that gave him the least room to do anything but stop. On March 29, 2026, deputies and state troopers moved on a plan built around a routine traffic stop. They pulled Covington over on an ordinary stretch of road and took him into custody without incident. Body camera footage from the stop later showed officers walking him through exactly why he was being detained. A warrant out of Michigan, 29 years old, built on evidence collected the week Deborah Kennedy died. When officers asked him directly why his DNA had turned up inside her home, Covington didn't answer. He went quiet and stayed that way. He was extradited to Michigan on April 8th and arraigned the following day in Oakland County on charges of felony murder and open murder. The judge denied bond. Covington was remanded to the Oakland County Jail to await a probable cause conference, his case now moving through the same court system that had no name to attach to it for 29 years. The arrest closed a gap that had outlived 2 Southfield police chiefs and at least 1 full generation of detectives. The same systems that had carried Covington's fingerprints and his DNA for years without anyone asking the right question were, in the end, the systems that caught him. Not a tip, not a confession, not a witness finally coming forward. Just a name sitting where it had always been, waiting for someone to look in the right direction. In Royal Lake, the news landed the way it tends to in towns that size fast and without much warning. Neighbors who had known Covington for years as a quiet, unremarkable presence learned in the same afternoon that he carried a name from 29 years earlier they had never once heard him say. Nobody there had any reason to have asked. Back in Michigan, the warrant had already done its work before the cuffs went on. Weeks had built the case methodically over nearly 2 years, first the print, then the DNA. Then the cross-referencing of arrest records and known addresses that let investigators track Covington's movements from Arizona through Oak Park and Highland Park, and finally to Royal Lake. By the time deputies pulled him over on that Illinois road, there was very little left to confirm. The forensic case had already been made inside a lab. The traffic stop was simply the part where the rest of the world caught up to what the evidence had already proven. On April 14, 2026, the Southfield Police Department held a press conference at the station to announce the arrest. Chief Elvin Barron stood at the podium. Detective Brian Weeks stood beside him. In the room, seated among the reporters and the cameras, was Reggie Daniel, the cousin who had spent decades making sure this file never quietly disappeared. Reporters filled most of the seats, cameras already rolling. But the room held the particular stillness that settles over an announcement everyone already half expects to matter more than the average update. Nobody there needed the case explained to them. They needed to hear, finally, the name that went with it. He had already gotten the news before anyone else in that room. Someone from the department called him directly once the arrest was confirmed, and he took that call alone. Hearing for the first time in 29 years the answer to the only question he had ever asked them. The name they gave him belonged to a man Deborah's family had never heard of, not a feud, not an old grudge, not anyone with a story attached. Just a stranger who had turned out to live across the street the entire time. By the time the cameras in that room turned on, Reggie had already absorbed the news once, alone, over the phone. What the press conference gave him was a chance to say something back. Despite the extensive investigative efforts in 1997, the case remained unsolved for 29 years. Chief Barron told the room, framing the arrest not as a correction of anyone's failure, but as the moment science finally caught up to effort that had been there from the beginning. He credited the original 1997 detectives for doing everything available to them at the time, and he credited Weeks for recognizing, decades later, that the file was worth pulling back out. It's proof, he said, that even after decades evidence can still speak, and that the truth eventually finds its way through. Weeks spoke briefly about what closing the file meant to him personally, calling it one of the most important cases of his career. "We made a commitment to do everything possible," he told the room, framing the months of work as something owed to a family that had waited 3 decades for an answer. Daniel, speaking for that family, didn't reach for complicated language to describe his cousin. She was, in his words, a sweetheart, a darling. He told the room that no one in the family had been able to bring themselves to go back to that house since the killing, and that the years since had never stopped costing something. Even now, he said, the hurt is still there. He had gotten to know Weeks over the long stretch of the investigation, and when reporters asked what that had been like, he didn't reach for a complicated answer either. He simply said the detective reminded him of a bulldog, someone who, once he had hold of something, was not going to let it go. Covington's case moved forward in the weeks that followed inside the 46th District Court, with a probable cause conference scheduled for April 23rd in front of Judge Cynthia Arvin. He appeared in those early proceedings without an attorney listed in the public record, the same quiet posture, by most accounts, that he had carried through nearly 3 decades in Royal Lake. If convicted of either felony murder or open murder, he faces life in prison. None of that legal machinery existed yet on the night Deborah fought for her life in 1997. It exists now because 2 pieces of evidence, sealed and forgotten for 27 years, finally got the chance to say what they had been holding onto the entire time. Cases like this one are turning up more often than they used to, as departments across the country work back through decades of stored evidence, with tools that didn't exist when that evidence was first collected. Most of those files are still waiting. Deborah Kennedy's is one of the ones that didn't have to wait any longer. You were standing in that hallway at the start of this story, inside a moment that lasted only as long as it took Deborah Kennedy to fight back. She didn't know, in that moment, that the piece of skin caught under her fingernails would outlive every excuse anyone ever had for not checking it. She didn't know that 29 years later, a detective named Brian Weeks would pull her file out of a drawer holding thousands of others, and decide hers was worth one more try. She didn't know how to fight. That much the evidence makes certain. Robert Covington is 58 years old now, sitting in the Oakland County Jail, denied bond, facing charges that carry a life sentence if convicted. He spent 29 years building an unremarkable life under his own name in a town of 300 people. Close enough the entire time that his fingerprints and his DNA sat in federal systems that already had everything they needed to find him. They were simply never asked to look. Reggie Daniel is still here too. He's the cousin who refused to let a file become a memory, who walked into a police station in person when phone calls stopped working, who got the news before anyone else in that press conference room, because he had spent decades earning the right to hear it first. The 2 words he chose for Deborah that day weren't the kind of words anyone puts in a case file. They're the kind you save for a person. The motive may never surface. The math of who finally has. A credit card on a bedroom floor and 4 fingernails carried a man's identity across 29 years, waiting for somebody to finally look. 29 years ago, a door opened on Lee Baker Drive because Deborah trusted the man standing on the other side of it. That trust is gone now, replaced by a warrant, a jail cell, and a court date. What's left in its place is smaller than justice and larger than nothing. A name, finally attached to the evidence that had been waiting to give it up the whole time. If this case stayed with you, let us know in the comments. And if you want to be here the next time a cold case finally catches up to the truth, subscribe before you go.